What's up everybody, Rob here. So Age of Empires 2, The Age of Kings is easily the greatest real-time strategy game of all time. And anybody who says otherwise is, well, probably a communist and their opinion can be disregarded. So what I'm going to be doing is looking at the unique units of the original game. And I'm not going to be touching any of the expansion packs because, well, that's something like 35, I think, different factions with unique units for each one. And I don't feel like doing that. Maybe I'll cover it in another video, but right now I'm sticking with the original game. And what I'm going to do is determine if these unique units are historically accurate, what inspired them historically, and how to make them more accurate if need be. So, in other videos, I already covered the Celtic Woad Raider, the Briton Longbowman, and the Turkish Janissary. Just to sum up real quick, the Celtic Woad Raider is completely off the rails as far as historical accuracy goes. The Briton Longbowman is actually very closely accurate, and the Turkish Janissary is also very accurate. The links to those videos are in the description. Basically, I would do a unique video or a separate video for each one of these units. However, some of them really just aren't worth an entire video for. So I'm just going to go through all the rest all together at once. If you are missing those three, though, if your favorites are the Celtic Woad Raider, the Briton Longbowman, or the Turkish Janissary, check the description box. I will not be covering them any further. All right, without any further ado, here we go. So first off, here we have the Franks and their unique unit, the Throwing Axemen. So the first question is, who were the Franks? Now, they were a Germanic tribe that sliced off a chunk of territory from the rotting corpse that was the Roman Empire. They settled in what is now France and Germany, and they actually gave their name to the region or the nation that is now known as France. And actually, in German, the country of France is known as Frankreich, or Realm of the Franks. And in-game, they are basically a stand-in for France and French culture. Now, the Throwing Axemen in-game are infantrymen roughly equivalent to the swordsman line, but also have a ranged attack. Basically, they throw axes at their enemy. That's why they're called the Throwing Axemen. So, what inspired this? Well, the Franks were known to use the Francesca axe, which is what you see here, a weapon that could be thrown with devastating effect. Because of the wavy design you see here, if they're thrown properly at the ground, they could actually bounce, strangely enough, causing absolute havoc amongst enemy lines, bouncing around in completely unpredictable ways. There's also accounts of them being able to shatter shields, and there have been tests of it where these things, I've actually seen it, where these things bounce really in completely unpredictable ways, sometimes skimming low over the ground and taking people's kneecaps out, sometimes bouncing high enough to clear a person. So say you have people standing in a shield wall, it'll clear the first rank and then land somehow in the rear ranks, causing absolute havoc there. How they were used, or at least how they were used in combat, is unknown. I personally think it was done sort of like Roman Pilum, sort of like volley fire, I guess you can say, for lack of a better term. The Franks would line up against their opponents. They would all pull out their Franciscas, and they would all throw them all at once. And they would start bouncing around in unpredictable ways, some of them shattering at the shield, some of them taking out heads, some of them taking out legs, some of them bouncing around in the rear ranks, just causing absolute havoc. And while the enemy's trying to figure out what's going on because all these axes are flying at them, the Franks would close ranks and charge in the middle of the confusion. So, basically you have an axe, which is a melee weapon, but you throw it. So, the Throwing Axemen as a historical unit, you know what? I'll give it a pass. It does make sense, and it is historically accurate in a manner of speaking. However, I just want to point out that this was really not something that was used outside of the early Middle Ages, or in game terms, the Dark Ages. I know Dark Ages is kind of frowned upon in modern academic circles, but you know what? That's what they called it in game, so I'm just going to go with it. But basically, by the time of the High Middle Ages, like the 11th, 12th century, it had already fallen out of favor, and this is the point where most of the game is set, so yeah, it's a bit dated. For example, the Joan of Arc campaign, you basically play as the Franks, and we're talking the 15th century, and no, they did not have Throwing Axemen at this point, but you know what? I'll let it go. Is it historically accurate? Meh, close enough. All right, next up, moving further east, you have the Teutons, which is, first off, my favorite civilization, and their unique unit, the Teutonic Knight, exemplifies my personal playstyle, this slow, grinding, inexorable advance. Now, the Teutons originally were a tribe of Germans who were first recorded as plaguing the ancient Romans as far back as the time of the Roman Republic. The name Teuton came to be associated with Germans in general, even though they oftentimes had nothing to do with the original tribe. In-game, they are a stand-in for the Germans as an ethnic group, basically the Holy Roman Empire. Now, the Teutonic Knights specifically were an order of Crusader knights that first formed in the Holy Land of German speakers, and they did often operate there in the Holy Land, but bulk of their operations would take place along the Baltic coast, where they fought against the last pagan holdouts in that region, and basically were known for fighting in the Northern Crusades, basically Northern Europe, and into what is now Poland, Lithuania, and Russia. Now, the Teutonic Knights were arranged in a similar manner to that of other crusading orders, such as the Templars and the Hospitallers, and in-game they are very slow-moving infantrymen with a lot of HP and armor, making them second only to the Persian War Elephant as the most tanky of all the units in the game. Also, they are the slowest, with the exception being the Persian War Elephant. So, does any of this make sense? Well, not really. There's absolutely no evidence that they were slower than any other soldier of that time. They did have a great deal of armor, so that part is at least correct. They would be provided by the order itself, and they would be given a mail hauberk, a heater shield, and iron helmet, usually a great helmet or something else of that type. But that really doesn't make a huge difference as far as speed go, and they also made very extensive use of cavalry, mitigating any speed problems that much further. I'm chalking this completely up to game balance. Basically, their weaponry and equipment was really no different from that of any other knight or equivalent. They weren't all knights. Sometimes they did have sergeants who were basically infantrymen, but basically it was no different from that of anybody else from that era. So to make them more historically accurate, you would have to put them, at least the full knights, would be on horseback, and you would have to give them a very high attack. Just basically, like I said, they had the same equipment of any other knight of that era, so they would just be another clone of the knight line, which makes no sense. Maybe give them a little more attack, or maybe since knights had to provide their own equipment and the Teutonic Knights equipment would be issued by the order, maybe make it higher quality so that they can take more hits. But really, there's nothing that particularly stands out amongst the Teutonic Knights that makes them, easily translated into a unique unit. So I'm chalking this one up to game balance. Is it historically accurate? Meh, not really. Next up, you have the Goths and their unique unit, the Huscarl. Now, the Goths are also Germanic, although they seem to represent an earlier version of German culture. They were a stand-in for the Saxons in the Hastings and the Vinland Saga battle scenario. And historically, the Goths originated somewhere in Scandinavia or northern Germany, and during the later portion of the Roman Empire, they migrated south and west, being pushed further on by advancing Huns. And they eventually became one of the contributing factors in the fall of the Roman Empire. The Visigoths, a subset of the Goths, sacked the city in 410, hastening the empire's fall. Now, their unique unit, the Huscarl, is an infantryman roughly equivalent to the swordsman, but with a very high pierce armor, making them all but invulnerable to arrows and other ranged attacks. So, is this accurate? Well, historically, a Huscarl was a member of the royal household, or basically a guard of the royal household, being charged with the protection of the king or the chieftain and his family. Now, they were given the best armor and equipment available, and in Saxon times, they oftentimes would be depicted as carrying great axes, or big two-handed axes, sometimes referred to as Dane axes, although they could be depicted as using shields and other equipment of the era. So, is their depiction in the game accurate? Well, their armor was better than that of most soldiers of the era. They would be given a mail shirt and an iron helmet of various designs depending on the region and era. Now, these pieces of equipment could offer a great deal of protection against arrows, but there's really nothing about their nature or equipment that is specific against range attacks. And oftentimes, like I said, they're depicted in, for example, the Bio Tapestry as using big two-handed axes, which does leave them more vulnerable to missile weapons compared to, say, carrying a shield. So, anything about the Huscarls that actually makes them, resistant to arrow fire? Well, not really, no. No, really, it actually didn't work out too well for them at Hastings, where they were all basically cut down by a combined force of cavalry and missile fire from the Normans. I'm probably, again, going to have to chalk this up to game balance, so not very historically accurate. Now, as far as to make it historically accurate, I would make them like the swordsman line, but with a higher attack rating, and this would be a representative of the Danex. Basically have them carrying around a two-handed weapon, and give them an extra attack, and maybe give them a bonus against cavalry. Basically like swordsman, but with a bonus against cavalry. But then again, I don't know if that would work because you already have the spearman line for that. So I don't know why it would give them bonus against cavalry. Well, there's oftentimes legends that state that the Dane axes in the hands of a capable wielder could decapitate a horse. So maybe go with that, I guess, kind of. I don't know. You'd have to break game balance for any of this to work. So anyway, I'm just disregarding game balance. There you go. All right, moving further north, you have the Vikings. Now, first off, you know who the Vikings are. I'm not going to explain them. And yes, I'm perfectly aware that they weren't called Vikings. Vikings was a job description, not so much, a culture or an ethnicity or anything. Yes, I know. I'm not going to explain any further than that. You guys know who Vikings are and what they're all about. Now, in the original game, they were the only civilization with two unique units, the Longship and the Berserk. So first off, let's look at the Longship. Now, historically, the Longship was a marvel of technology. It was a vessel with a shallow draft and was also symmetrical from stem to stern, basically from the front of the ship to the back, basically meaning that it didn't really have a front or a back. That meant that it could navigate the maze of river systems that crisscross Europe, allowing them to raid further inland. The symmetry meant that they could pull up onto shore, raid, smash and grab, and basically do whatever they wanted, and then jump on board and escape before any real resistance showed up without having to pull a K-turn. Longships were also faster and much more maneuverable than their counterparts. Now, in-game, they are depicted as warships that shoot a storm of arrows instead of a single ballista bolt used by the warship line, and are able to engage both ships and land targets. So is this accurate? Well, they could and oftentimes did use arrows from ships to attack other ships and shore targets, sure, yes. But they also used spears to throw, and most naval battles of that era were actually boarding actions, which basically meant you would pull up alongside another ship, grapple them, hop aboard, and you basically take care of business axe in hand. So is their depiction in game accurate? Well, the look of them, yes. That actually is pretty much what a longship looks like. But as far as the mechanics go, no. They weren't really known for deploying storms of arrows at their target. Not really accurate at all. Really, they were more raiding vessels that could be used mostly as landing craft for raids. And also, they could make transatlantic journeys with them. But, as far as combat goes, they were really more transport vessels than anything else. To make it more accurate, just make it a transport ship, but one that can actually fight back, either with the arrows as depicted in-game, or just the standard ballista of the warship line, but with the capacity for a few soldiers added on. Now, you can make it a smaller capacity than that of a standard transport, say half that amount, but just add in the ability for it to shoot back at its opponent to make it like the actual longship, a very versatile vessel that can be used to transport troops, but also as a fighting platform. Now, moving on to the other unique unit of the Vikings, the Berserk. And this is another infantry unit similar to the swordsman line, but one that can actually regenerate its health over time. So, what is the deal here? Is it historically accurate, and what inspired it? Well, there's a ton of controversy over this one, and to make it more historically accurate, that's going to be a bit of a problem because nobody actually knows how any of this actually was historically accurate, or even if it even existed to begin with. So the traditional view is that berserkers would wear bear or wolf pelts, and that's actually what it means. It means bear shirt, like, they wore animal pelts, bear pelts, and that they would wear these animal pelts, nothing else, and they would work themselves up into a frenzy and then charge at the enemy axe in hand. And in some legends, no blade or weapon could harm them. They could kill men and horses alike, and all who stood before them died that day. Hail, gods of war! Man of War, Sons of Odin is a freaking fantastic song. I love that song so much. Any case, but yes, actually, according to some of the sagas, they were worked up into such a fury, and they were blessed by the gods, particularly Odin, that no weapon could bite them. The terminology uses that no weapon or any object made of iron or steel could bite them. Of course, this is not true whatsoever, because you have guys basically just wearing animal skins charging at a bunch of guys with sharp, pointy objects. They're going to die pretty quickly. And most people believe that the idea of berserks wearing bear shirts and charging in, this is all based on a mistranslation. The bear shirt thing was oftentimes just a symbol of rank, sort of like a king's champion, kind of like a huskarl. Basically, Lindy Beige actually did a fantastic video on this a couple of years ago, and he explains it much better than I am doing here. But basically, this is all a mistranslation, and depictions of guys charging into battle without any sort of heed for their own safety. that's probably just regular men, not specific, berserkers or anything like that. They would just, basically regular guys that would work themselves up into a battle fury and go charging at the enemy. Yeah, so are berserkers even real? Never mind, are they historically accurate in game terms? Are they even real historically? Well, that's a ton of controversy there. Some people say yes, some say no. Yeah, there's like a gray area in between. But in any case, there is absolutely nothing in any of the legends of them magically healing. So in order to figure out how to make them historically accurate, at least somewhat historically accurate, we have to kind of blend the historical version with the legend. So regenerating health is right out of the question. So we got here a bunch of men who rush into battle with absolute fury, don't care about their safety, wear little, if any, armor, but they hit like a ton of bricks. So what we need to do is have a fast-moving foot soldier with low armor and low HP, but very high attack rating, basically glass cannons. Also make them much cheaper than would be expected for a unique unit, allowing the player to swarm over their enemies with numbers. Now, historically, there weren't a lot of berserkers, however you define the term, but it would get across the idea that you could overwhelm an enemy with fury and violence of action. Also, you would have to give them, or at least this particular unit, a very fast construction time, something like the Goths and their civilization bonus. You can just churn out infantry, well, like that, but just for this particular unique unit. And basically make it a combination of the Celtic Woad Raider with its speed and the Goths Huskarl. Basically, this unit that can just, very cheap unit, relatively speaking, that you can just swarm over your enemies with. Again, we're completely disregarding any sort of game balance with this. So there you go, the Berserk. Heading further south now, we are moving on to the Byzantines, which is my second favorite civilization after the Teutons. Now, they are the remnants of the Roman Empire, which split between the eastern and the western half. The death of the Western Roman Empire is considered to be the end of the ancient world and the start of the Middle Ages. While all this was going on, the eastern half persisted onwards for another millennium or so. Now, I won't go into the details of the history of the Eastern Roman Empire. The term Byzantines being applied to them came much, much later, well after their fall in 1453. But in any case, I won't go into details, but they had their ups, they had their downs, and they had their really far downs, 1204. Now, culturally, they were a blend of Eastern and Western influences, and basically they were caught right in between the West and the East, so their military and their culture reflected this. Now, in-game, their unique unit is the Cataphract, which is an armored cavalryman who has splash damage or basically hits multiple targets at once. Is this historically accurate? Well, it's not bad. It's really not bad. Now, historic Cataphracts were used in the ancient world by armies throughout the Near East, including the Parthians, the Sassanids, and later adopted by the Eastern Roman Empire. Now, they are armored horsemen whose mounts were also covered in armor as well, usually chainmail, which is outrageously expensive and therefore made them very limited in supply, and the game got that right. Now, in-game, they are depicted as armored cavalry, which is correct, but the splash damage, well, directly, no. Of course, a weapon can only hit one target at a time, but a horse, a rider, all armored, sprinting at a target at once and plowing into a formation would cause all kinds of havoc. They would basically be a living battering ram, smashing through formations, so the splash damage is just a representation of this type of shock and awe. So, overall, is it historically accurate? Yeah, you know what? I'll give it a pass. Again, we have to take game design into consideration. I am totally cool with it. The Byzantine Cataphracts, they're freaking awesome. I love them. They're great. So next up, you have the Saracens and their unique unit, the Mamluks. So the Saracens are a generic term used by the Europeans for Muslims, usually those of Arab descent, but more often than not, they would just be all Muslims lumped together in this group, regardless of their origins, which included the Turks, which was an actual ethnic group, and sometimes the two terms would be used interchangeably. In any case, this is an incredibly vague terminology, and the game uses them just as Muslim forces in the Holy Land around the time of the Crusades, so I'm just going to go with that as well. Now, their unique unit, the Mamluk, is a camel-riding warrior that throws his sword and gets attack bonuses against mounted units. The term Saracen is a very vague terminology, but the Mamluks were actually real and very specific. They were slave soldiers that served under various Muslim dynasties, usually from places outside of the Muslim world. For example, they would be recruited from the Caucasus, the Balkans, and other places, and were more often than not Christians. They were basically a proto-version of the Janissary Corps under the Ottomans centuries later. They would eventually gain control over portions of the Muslim world, including Egypt, and would inflict a major defeat against the Mongols, one of the few who actually managed to pull that off. So is their depiction in-game accurate? Well, the Mamluks was actually a class of soldier and a social class, not a specific troop type. They could fight as infantry, as cavalry, and as archers, and even sometimes as cavalry archers, with no real limitation in the type of equipment that was used. So there's really no one method of fighting that could be depicted in-game. Now, camels in warfare were real, and they actually did frighten horses. Horses are very skittish creatures, and they tend to freak out when they see something they're not used to. But throwing swords, no. Now, first off, the swords that are shown in-game are wrong. At the time of the Crusades, they were usually using straight blades with the curved scimitars that are often depicted in the Middle East of Ottoman design from centuries later. Actually, at the time of the Crusades, the weapons the type of swords that the Saracens used and the type that the Europeans used were actually vaguely similar, basically the double-edged straight blade, arming sword type. Now, the massive curved sword that you see in the game are also not balanced for throwing, and throwing weapons from horseback is difficult under the best of circumstances, and there is nobody ever in history that walked around with stacks of swords and used them to pelt their enemies with. Yeah, generally speaking, swords are not the best type of weapon to be thrown anyway. Now, there is a type of throwing sword that was from Africa, but that's really all I'm aware of. Now, I'm sure sometime in history somebody had a sword and they threw it at somebody. I'm sure that happened. But again, nobody walked around with a bag full of swords that they kept pulling them out and chucking them at people, especially not from horseback. Now, how would I make this historically accurate? Well, maybe you would have to rearrange the entire game, have camels as their unique unit. You would have to get rid of the camels as a stable unit for the other factions and give them straight to the Saracens. Well, this is actually historically accurate because when European horses first encountered camels in the Middle East, they did tend to freak out, and that did cause some problems. You would have to basically take away the stable unit and then give it to the Saracens. Other than that, the term Saracen is incredibly vague, and the Mamluks, much like the Teutonic Knights as they're depicted in-game, there's really nothing unique about them that you can make a unique unit from. That's rather unfortunate. Yeah, Saracens are apparently one of the least popular factions in-game right now. Rather unfortunate. I actually do kind of like them a bit. Not my favorite, but, they're pretty good. So anyway, yeah, Saracens, there's really not much you can do with them. All right, moving on from there, you have the Persians. Now, moving on, you have the Persians and their unique unit, the war elephant. So, the Persian Empire went through several iterations over the course of its history and rose and fell many times. They were a major power in the Near East, fought against the Greeks in the ancient world, and were a constant thorn in the side of the eastern frontier of the Roman Empire for centuries, and eventually being major rivals of the Eastern Roman Empire, or the Byzantines. Now, the war elephant, or using elephants in warfare, were used by many cultures throughout history, both as pack animals and as living weapons. They could be used like battering rams to smash through enemy formations, and these are very large, powerful animals, obviously. They could stomp their enemies into the ground, use their trunks to pick up unfortunate victims, and their tusks could either be used directly as weapons, or they could be fitted with blades to impale their opponents. But their main attribute is their fear. These are absolutely terrifying creatures. They are massive, and they move very quickly, and I'll get to that in a second. And if you've never seen one before, or even heard of one before, and now a herd of them is charging right towards you with a guy on his back shooting arrows, you're having a bad day. Oh, and here's a pointy stick. Go deal with it. Yeah, and so that was their main advantage. So, is their depiction in-game accurate? Well, in-game, they are slow-moving cavalry that they actually are the slowest unit in-game, with an absolute frack ton of HP, and they do bonus damage against buildings. Actually, their sound effect for their attack is the same as that of the battering ram. Now, does this match reality? Well, they are huge beasts, so having a large amount of hit points makes sense. And actually, in reality, the best way to deal with elephants is to make them panic. It's very difficult to kill them, especially with pre-gunpowder weaponry. So oftentimes the best course of action would be to get them to freak out and charge and turn around and attack their own people in their panic. Rome Total War actually does a very good job of this. That mechanic, unfortunately, is not in this game. So, any case, they are depicted as being incredibly slow, the slowest in game. And are they slow in real life? Well, compared to horses, yes. The top speed of a horse over 400 yards was clocked at 43 miles an hour, and they have been depicted as being faster over shorter distances. The top speed of a human ever recorded was Usain Bolt, who was just a hair under 28 miles per hour, but he's an absolute freak of nature, and no, none of you are going to get anywhere near there. And especially a human cannot move as fast as that, especially loaded down with armor and other types of weaponry and equipment. Top speed of an elephant is, depending on who you talk to, it's actually very hard to get an accurate depiction of this, but somewhere between 25 and 35 miles an hour. The point is, they can move faster than you can. So they're slower than horsemen, but faster than infantry. So not as slow as in the game. That was purely for game balance purposes. Now, they do have a vulnerability to the spear line or the pike line, which, sure, why not? I mean, okay, sure. I mean, they are a type of cavalry, so having them vulnerable against spears. Again, pointy stick against something that big, it's going to take a lot of hits to take that thing down, but, okay, sure, why not? Now, their vulnerability to monks is there purely for game balances. I have not heard of anything about monks or any other sort of holy man of any religious persuasion having any sort of effect on them. Yeah, so overall they're kind of meh as far as accuracy goes. I mean, some things yes, some things no. Now, to make them more accurate, make them faster than infantry but slower than cavalry. Extra damage against buildings. Well, they aren't stupid creatures, and they won't charge directly into a building, and they won't bash their head into it like you see in the game. You would actually have to do something like hook up ropes to it and then use the elephants as like a truck, basically, like you're towing the thing away and pulling a building down. Mechanics like that don't exist in this game, so no. Bonuses against buildings, I don't see it. Maybe they can do splash damage against cavalry. Now, horses, much like camels, they do tend to freak out when confronted with an elephant or pretty much any creature that they're unfamiliar with. So, yeah, they can do extra bonuses against cavalry, and they do splash damage, sort of like the cataphract. And, again, make them faster than infantry, but slower than cavalry. That's the best I can do. Maybe. So, yeah, overall, their historical accuracy is kind of meh. All right, next up you have the Mongols and their unique unit, the Mangudai. Now, the Mongols were a group of nomadic tribes that stormed out of the steppes, conquered much of Asia and parts of the Middle East and Europe, and created the largest contiguous land empire ever in history. They dominated their opponents using horse archers, devastating all who opposed them. You guys know who the Mongols are. I'm not going to go any further. Now, in-game, their unique unit is the Mangudai, which is a horse archer that does extra damage against siege equipment. So is this accurate? Well, the Mangudai are somewhat shrouded in myth. There's not a lot of info about them. And what little info we do know about them seems to indicate that these are suicide troops. They would charge into the enemy, lose a bunch of men in the process, then turn and run away, causing the enemy to get overconfident. And they would then break the relative safety of their formation to give chase, or then they would be ambushed as the original force either turned around or would lead them into another force to ambush them. The Mangudai specialized in this type of warfare. Now, horse archers did make sense. The Mongols excelled at horse archery, obviously. Anti-siege, no, I don't really see how they would get bonuses against anti-siege. I just don't see that at all. Maybe it's a sort of a representation of the dominance of steppe peoples over more settled peoples, who these more settled peoples were needed to create siege equipment. You know, when the Mongols had their great siege equipment, that wasn't them, it was actually Chinese engineers that they pressed into service. That's kind of a stretch at best, though. Really, I just don't see how horse archers could be, you know, particularly... I just don't see how the Mangudai are in any way associated with attacking siege equipment. Maybe to get the suicide troop angle down, maybe a Lancer type, something like something that moves very fast but doesn't hit very hard, but has a lot of HP, so they can take the hits, charge in, maybe get the enemy player to chase after them to try to, you know, get them to, you know, push them away or something, you know, push them from attacking your villagers or something. and then they can run away, get healed by a monk, or get garrisoned up, and then they can ride out hit again. Basically, a more durable version of the scout line, I guess, maybe. Is it historically accurate? Not really. All right, next up you have the Chinese and their unique unit, the Chuko-Nu. Now, one of the oldest civilizations in history, the Chinese have a long history of warfare. A lot of it with foreign invasions and external expansions, civil wars, rebellions, bandits, and just really much all kinds of, and pretty much any other sort of chaos you can think of. This constant fighting led to tons of innovation, especially in the realm of military hardware. And the Chuko-Nu is a perfect example of this. It is an automatic crossbow, or it's been described as an automatic crossbow. It's not really auto, it's more semi-auto, capable of shooting a bolt, restraining the mechanism, dropping another bolt, and shooting again with the pump of a lever. It's sort of, I don't have the video of it. My screen capture technology is not working too well here. But I've seen it depicted and used. It's sort of like a cross between a lever action and a pump action, but in crossbow form. Now, does this thing actually exist historically? Well, yes, actually, and it was actually used for a very, very long period of time, many, many centuries, and it was actually successfully deployed in many different instances. Now, there weren't that many of them compared to more conventional type of ranged weaponry, for example, standard crossbows and just bow and arrows. And it does actually have some limitations. The bolts, crossbow bolts in general are fairly light, and these are even lighter than that. And they have very limited power. Of course, because of the nature of the mechanism, it is not a very powerful mechanism, has a very short range, and it's really more of the novelty than a serious weapon type. It's more of the shock factor. Basically, if you're charging at the enemy and this storm of bolts comes out after you, that's really going to tend to freak people out rather than dropping guys with serious firepower. It's not like you're not going to take a bolt and like punch it right through somebody's skull or anything like that. So is this historically accurate? Well, yeah, actually it is. The Chinese are an archer-based civilization, so they tend to spam those out a lot. And the Chuko-Nu just basically means that whenever you approach a Chinese force, either their settlement or an army in the field, they're going to have a ton of these archers, with them with these Chuko-Nu. And basically, there's just going to be a storm of arrows the whole way, and it's just a pain to deal with. Unless you're the Goths with the Huscarls, of course, but that's neither here nor there. So overall, actually, it is pretty accurate. Not perfect, but yeah, pretty good. Pretty good. And last but certainly not least are the Japanese and their unique unit, the samurai. Now, Japan has a very long and rich history of warfare, and the centerpiece of this history would be the samurai, which is more or less equivalent to the knight of feudal Europe. They were a social class as well as a warrior elite. And, okay, you guys know who the samurai are. I'm not going to go any further. If you don't know who the samurai are, I don't know what to tell you. You guys know about this. Now, in-game, the samurai are infantrymen, roughly equivalent to the swordsman line, and they are specialized and get attack bonuses taking down other unique units. Now, is this historically accurate? Well, samurai, at least initially, were archers, and particularly they were mounted archers, and in-game they are depicted as being infantrymen, and they use their katanas instead of bows and arrows. Now, why do they do this? Because the katana is the best of thought ever. It can literally, cut through anything, because it's, the greatest sword ever. It was folded, 1 billion times, and it can, cut a tank in half. It's, amazing. Okay, good. Now that I've insulted all the weebs out there, the idea of the duelist, or this idea of the samurai using a katana as his primary weapon, that's more pop culture than anything else. Again, like I said, they use the bow and arrow, oftentimes from horseback, but they also use naginata and a whole bunch of other weapons. Could they use katanas? Absolutely. Was it their primary weapon? No, not really. But does it make sense that they are swordsmen with bonuses against unique units? Well, if you consider the idea of the unique unit as sort of like the champion of an army, and the samurai were very good at dueling, so think of it as, champion fighting against champion, and the samurai coming out on top because they are specialized duelists. Not during the Warring States period, which is most of the time during the Middle Ages, or what would be the Middle Ages in Europe. That came mostly later during the Edo period, which is actually what would be in Europe the early modern period. But you know what? I'll give it a pass. I'll give it a pass. Just consider it like champions or one group of champions fighting against other groups of champions and single combat duels of honor and all that stuff. It's not, again, the samurai history is way more complex than that, but you know what? I will let it go because, sure, why not? So, any case, there you are. That is it for this video. I hope you found this interesting and entertaining. It was a lot of fun to put this together. Gave me back a lot of memories. Playing this is my all-time favorite game, so had a lot of fun with it. Any case, that is it. Please hit the like and subscribe button. More videos coming out whenever I get around to it. Have a good day. Or don't have a good day. You're an adult. Have any kind of day you want. See you later.